The U.S. Navy controls the open ocean. 2 carrier strike groups, 8 Aegis destroyers, the most advanced surface fleet ever assembled. And yet, the Strait of Hormuz stayed closed. Not because the Navy lost, because the Navy was never designed for this specific problem. And understanding that gap explains something much bigger than one battle. It explains why the most powerful Navy in human history had to pick up the phone and call the Air Force. Modern naval power was engineered for deep water, open ocean, long distances, high-value targets. The Strait of Hormuz is none of those things. The actual shipping lane, the corridor where tankers must legally transit, is 6 nautical miles wide, 2 miles inbound, 2 miles outbound, 2 miles of buffer between them. That is the entire operational space, nothing more. And inside that space, the rules of naval engagement change completely. Large warships cannot maneuver freely inside it. Radar systems designed to track missiles at hundreds of nautical miles now face targets at close range, moving fast, hiding among thousands of civilian vessels. The advantage of size becomes a liability in a corridor that offers no room to turn. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps built their entire naval strategy around that geometry. Not warships, speedboats, over 1,500 of them. Fiberglass hulls, some exceeding 70 knots, each carrying a missile with enough range and terminal speed to mission kill a frigate. And each boat costs between $50,000 and $500,000. That last number is the entire problem, because engaging them with naval missiles designed for blue water warfare creates a cost equation the Navy cannot sustain indefinitely. Iran did not build a blue water fleet to challenge America. They built a brown water swarm, cheap, fast, and numerous enough to exploit the one weakness no amount of naval spending had ever solved: volume. In a 6-mile corridor, 1,500 boats moving simultaneously from every direction do not need to win a battle. They just need to make the cost of every engagement unsustainable. And they nearly did. Because the Navy's answer to every threat came from the same missile inventory, the same VLS cells, the same precision weapons engineered for targets worth millions, not thousands. The geometry of Hormuz did not break American naval power. It exposed the boundary of it. And that boundary is exactly where air power begins. Every major weapons system on a carrier strike group was designed for a specific threat profile: long range, high value, deep water. The Strait of Hormuz presents the opposite profile on every single dimension. The SM-6 interceptor was built to track large, fast-moving targets at extended range, against a composite speedboat doing 70 knots between container ships. That is engineering mismatch, not failure. The Mark 45 deck gun fires up to 20 rounds per minute, effective against one target. The swarm doctrine sends 30 to 50 boats simultaneously from every direction. The math does not work. The phalanx close-in system empties its magazine in 20 seconds, for minutes to reload, against continuous waves of incoming contacts. That reload window is the vulnerability Iran designed around. Carrier strike aircraft are optimized for speed and range. At 500+ knots, a pilot has less than 2 seconds of visual contact with any surface target in a 6-mile corridor. Distinguishing a military vessel from a civilian fishing boat at that speed is a physics problem, not a training problem. The Navy is not weak. The Navy is mismatched. And there is a critical difference between those two things. A weak force loses because it lacks power. A mismatched force loses because it brought the right power to the wrong problem. That distinction matters because it changes the solution entirely. If the Navy were simply weak, the answer would be more ships, more missiles, more funding. But the Navy was not weak at Hormuz. It was over-engineered for a different fight. Every weapon it carried was the best in the world at what it was designed to do. The problem was the target. $50,000 fiberglass speedboats do not justify million-dollar answers. And a 6-mile shipping lane filled with civilian vessels does not forgive a targeting system built for open ocean warfare. The solution was not more naval power. It was a different aircraft entirely. The specific capability the Navy needed had 4 requirements: slow enough to visually identify targets in a crowded civilian waterway, persistent enough to stay on station for hours without returning to a carrier, cheap enough per engagement to sustain operations against $50,000 threats, survivable enough to absorb ground fire and keep operating. No aircraft in the current carrier air wing meets all four requirements. Simultaneously, the A-10 Super Hornet costs $30,000 per flight hour. It crosses the shipping lane too fast for reliable visual target identification. Its on-station time at combat loadout is a fraction of what corridor patrol demands. The MH-60R Seahawk helicopter can identify and engage small surface targets, but it carries limited munitions per sortie and was built primarily for anti-submarine warfare, not sustained swarm engagement. The aircraft that meets all four requirements is the A-10 Thunderbolt II, not because it is advanced, because it was built for cluttered, close-range, contested environments where pilots need time to identify targets before engaging. Its 300-knot patrol speed gives 3 times longer visual contact than a carrier jet, 2.5 hours on station without rotation. GAU, 8 cannon firing 65 rounds per second. Cost per engagement under $10,000. A titanium cockpit built to absorb 23mm armor-piercing rounds and keep flying. Every design characteristic the Air Force called a limitation: slow speed. Straight wings, heavy armor, became a direct operational advantage in a 6-mile brown water corridor. The A-10 was not designed for naval warfare, but every engineering decision made in the 1970s to solve a land warfare problem in Europe produced an aircraft that solved a naval warfare problem in the Middle East 50 years later. That is not irony. That is what good engineering looks like when the problem changes, but the physics do not. The right tool does not always wear the right label. Air power does not replace naval power at Hormuz. It completes it. The layered system operating over the strait divides the threat environment by category and assigns each layer to the platform best suited for it. The A-10 operates at 3,000 feet. GU-8 cannon and laser-guided rockets handle fast boats and coastal positions at close range. Cost per engagement under $10,000. Flight hour cost $19,000. AH-64 Apache helicopters operate at 200 feet from expeditionary sea bases, floating forward operating bases that put Army aviation on a Navy platform for the first time at this scale. Each Apache carries precision-guided missiles and a 30mm chain gun. They engage threats that move through the first layer. The Navy's Aegis destroyers maintain the air defense umbrella above both layers, preserving their advanced missile inventory exclusively for Mach 3 threats that nothing else in the inventory can stop. Before this combined architecture, destroyers were firing advanced interceptors at speedboats, draining precision missile inventories against targets they were never designed to engage. After, each platform handles the exact threat category it was engineered for. The Navy stops bleeding its VLS cells on low-cost targets. The Air Force fills the persistent, close-range layer the Navy was never built to provide. The Army extends its attack reach onto a naval platform. 3 branches, 1 corridor, each covering the gap the others cannot fill. Iran's swarm doctrine was designed for a Navy fighting alone. It calculated the boats needed to drain a destroyer's vertical launch system before reinforcements arrived. That calculation was correct for a single branch response. It did not account for the Air Force at 3,000 feet or Army helicopters staging from a ship. The combined system did not just blunt the swarm. It made the entire strategic calculation obsolete. And that shift from single branch to combined arms is the real story of Hormuz. What the Strait of Hormuz exposed is not a Navy problem. It is a doctrine problem. The United States spent decades and trillions of dollars optimizing its military for pure conflict, open ocean, long range, high altitude, precision strike against sophisticated adversaries. That investment is correct for that threat. But the world's most strategically critical choke points are not open ocean. They are narrow, congested, brown water, full of civilian traffic. The Strait of Hormuz is 6 miles wide. The Taiwan Strait is 110 miles at its narrowest, still a fraction of open ocean. The Strait of Malacca, through which 40% of global trade passes, is less than 2 miles wide at its narrowest point. These are the corridors where the global economy is actually vulnerable, and none of them favor the weapons systems the U.S. military has been building for the last 3 decades. The A-10 worked at Hormuz because it was designed for cluttered, close-range, contested environments where identification matters as much as firepower. But the A-10 fleet retires by September 2026. What replaces it must answer the same 4 requirements that made the Warthog irreplaceable here: slow enough to identify, persistent enough to patrol, cheap enough to sustain, survivable enough to absorb. The F-35 is faster, stealthier, and more lethal at range, but it costs $44,000 per flight hour and was not built to fly racetrack loops over a 6-mile shipping lane, identifying fiberglass speedboats for 2.5 hours. The gap the A-10 leaves is not just an Air Force problem. It is a naval problem. It is a doctrine problem, because Hormuz proved, in real combat against a real adversary with a deliberate strategy, that the most expensive military in history cannot fight every environment alone. The right tool won here. The question now is whether the right tool exists for the next narrow corridor, because the next one will not wait for the Pentagon to find the answer. The Navy did not fail at Hormuz. It discovered its boundary, and air power filled that boundary with an aircraft the Pentagon had been trying to retire for 15 years. Subscribe to Naval Power Explained. Drop your answer in the comments. When the A-10 leaves, what fills the gap?